Hello, let's talk about early modern English morphology. Remember that early modern English is the period of English between roughly late 1400s, early 1500s, all the way up to about 1700, 1725, 50-ish, right? These are blurry lines, right? There's no hard, clean line where somebody woke up and said, oh, I'm speaking early modern English today. Middle English, over. All right. So we're also talking about morphology. What is morphology? Morphology is how words are put together, how words are inflected, like different cases and conjugations. It's how compounds are formed. It's kind of the inside the word kind of mechanics of a language. And this is a place where the biggest changes in morphology of English took place between Old English and Middle English. But a lot of those changes continued to happen and accelerated and shifted to other parts of the language in the early modern English period. And what this means is that we got changes in the pronoun system from Middle English to early modern English, and changes in the pretty significant changes in the pronoun system during the early modern English period, which we'll talk about to some extent in this video. There was also further changes in verb endings. Let's just go back here. We're just kind of joking around here because whom is a pronoun and st is a verb ending. So the reason whomst is funny is because we have an archaic verb ending on a increasingly archaic pronoun form. So those things don't go together. It's incongruous. That's why it's funny. Homesteadative, it's even funnier because then you're just, yeah. Anyway, changes in pronoun system. There were changes in verb endings, or conjugation is a word you might have learned if you've studied any language formally. There were also changes in how adjectives form comparatives and superlatives, like good, better, best, long, longer, longest. And overall, there was an increasing process of inflection loss. That is, more and more of a shift of English from the synthetic to the analytic category of language, where the function of words is increasingly determined not by changes in the form of the word itself, but by its position in the sentence. Let's look at the pronoun system first. As you can see here, the early modern English pronoun system, and this table is adapted from Van Gelder in page 170 in her History of the English Language. We can see that in early modern English, we have I, you, she, you, we, you, they. Now that seems very familiar because that's modern English. That's why we call it early modern English, because it is modern English. It's just early. But we do have variant forms, which you may recognize if you've read older literature. For the second person especially, we have the forms ye and thou. And in the plural, we also have ye. In the third person, we have this curious form of it, but was sometimes spelled hit. But that H dropped away pretty early during the early modern English period. Now, in the genitive form, we have my, mine, yours, or thy and thine. And we also have her, his, and his. What's that? What's his? Well, that's its, actually. Its was only developed. We'll talk about that. Ours, yours, theirs. Yep, me, you, thee, right? Thou is the subject, and thee is the object pronoun. Thou seest me, I seest thee, right? So it's like mixing up I and me. And people, when they're speaking their fake Renaissance fair, like put on, don't know what they're doing, early modern English, ye olde English, fake old type English. This is the mistake that they always make that drives me crazy. So if you're going to try to speak fake ye olde English, at least get your pronoun cases right. It's not that hard. We also have her, him, hit, and him as the accusative forms, the object forms. I saw hit or I saw him would sometimes be would be used as an inanimate, like a neuter kind of pronoun. That dropped down because we developed it and its, and us, you, and them. So we can see how it's close to what we have now, but changed a little bit. Now, the biggest change, the most conspicuous change, is of course the loss of thou, thee, thy, and thine, which was in Middle English a singular form as opposed to ye, you, your, yours, which was a plural form. Now, this wasn't originally the case, but you came to mean, in the early modern English period, you and thou, a lot of upper class people spoke and learned French. And French has what's called the tu vous distinction, where tu is used for friends, for familiar people, for intimates, for lovers, for you talk to children, you'd refer, or pets you refer to as tu, right? And, business associates, parents, elders, teachers, people you just meet in passing in a public place, you will refer to as vous, right? So there's a polite you and a familiar you. We have this in Spanish, tu usted, in German, du sie, and other languages as well, Italian. But it wasn't originally in English, but it was adapted into English, into thou and you by the early Middle English period. So thou is singular, you is plural, thou is familiar, and you is polite, right? So why is Darth Vader here saying, "What is thy bidding, my master?" and using what is a familiar form? Well, here's a curious fact that connects back to our discussion of the Bible a few videos ago. Biblical Hebrew has a familiar and a formal you as well. But David in the Psalms, when he's addressing God, uses the familiar pronoun to speak to God. And this is something that was adapted by all the translators, including into modern English. Thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory, right? That familiar is used with thy, and so that thou, thee has this flavor of archaicism, of oldness, which gives it a kind of ceremonial or formal quality. And this is what I think George Lucas is invoking when he has Darth Vader refer to his boss as thy. All right. So pronoun changes from Middle English to early modern English. By Shakespeare's, not long after Shakespeare's time, you has replaced thou. Thou drops away pretty quickly during the 17th century. It was never as rigid as the French tu veux. It was always something that was not like a natural part of the language, but was kind of imported. And there are specific religious groups, like Quakers, that continue to use thou and thy for religious reasons. You can Google it. It replaces his by analogy to yours and hers. These are the big pronoun changes. Okay, let's talk about some other early modern English developments in morphology now. One, reflexive pronouns emerge. A reflexive pronoun is a pronoun used as an object that refers to the same person or thing as the subject. So in Middle English or very early modern English, he might have said, he looked him in the mirror, right? But then later we get this himself. This is a form that emerges in the early modern English period. Didn't exist in Middle English. And also we have case disappearing in pronouns. Shakespeare and other early modern writers are pretty loosey-goosey about how they use I and you. All debts are cleared between you and I, he writes in The Merchant of Venice. It should be you and me because it's the object of the preposition between, right? Anyway, this is an ongoing process, right? That prescriptive grammar, which we're going to be talking a lot about in the next unit, but prescriptive grammar is trying to maintain certain distinctions, but they're the distinctions that had been reached around the middle of the 1700s, was when the language sort of gets frozen because people write grammar books. Before that, there's all kinds of changes going on. All kinds of things are changing. Ye was the subject version of you. Ye are going to the store today would be the plural, right? But that gets replaced by you. Who and whom are used interchangeably, and who was already replacing whom. Whom was already dropping out. in the 1600s. But it's for some reason the grammar writers in the 1700s liked whom. They're like, let's keep it. All right. More about early modern English morphology. Verbs. Now, this is a big change. This is one of the bigger changes here. One of the distinctive characteristics of Middle English and early modern English is that early modern English is that there are more verb conjugations. There are. We had and this is more stuff that Ren Fair fake Middle English speaker or early modern English speakers mess up, is messing up their verb endings by saying he walkest. No, he doesn't walkest. Thou walkest. He walketh. Get it right, people. I walk, thou walkest, he walketh, right? This was the conjugation system. But a couple things happened during the early modern English period. The est ending, thou didst, thou walkst, thou seest, that drops out. By 1600, it's being used less and less. And by 1650, it's old-fashioned. And the other thing is that the third person form, walketh, seeth, goeth, which was a Southern English form in the Middle English period, gets replaced by walks, sees, looks, which was a Northern English form in the Middle English period. And if you look at texts doing corpus linguistics in the late Middle Ages, you can see in scribal takes that the S is sort of creeping south and replacing the eth. And also, it's possible that just like now, how people spelled things wasn't necessarily how they pronounced it. So they might have been spelling things walketh, seeth, because that's how they learned how to write it, but saying walks and sees because that's what people were saying all around them. Shakespeare only uses hath and doth. In every other case, he uses walks, sees. The King James version, the King James Bible, which is about the same time as Shakespeare, uses that older third person, goeth, seeth, the wind bloweth where it listeth. And that's perhaps deliberately archaic, deliberately using an old-fashioned form, perhaps again because of the ceremonial flavor of older forms and also the influence of earlier English Bibles. See our video on the Bible in early modern England. A bit more on verbs. Strong versus weak verbs were organized differently in early modern English. I help him. I helped him. No, I hope him. I shake him. I shaked him. Right? No, I didn't. I shook him. I shaked him. Shake was a weak verb. Help was a strong verb. You get more verbs shifting from the strong to weak class. So I bide my time. I bided my time, they might have said. I bode my time, crowed, flay, flew, mow, moon. There are a lot of different forms of old-fashioned words here. Certain early modern English weak forms, though, have since become strong. You used to say the wind blowed. Now you say the wind blew. So we're not making more strong verbs, but in the early modern period, weak verbs were becoming strong verbs. Just a reminder, a strong verb is a verb where the vowel in the stem changes to indicate that it's past or a participle, rather than adding the suffix ed or d. And strong participles were more common as well. I bake, I baked, I have bacon, right? And these are things that are still kind of, when we learn the language, it's just so arbitrary that these distinctions are often the ones that we have to do the most work to correct children when they're learning the language first. And second of all, these are differences that we see the most differences in terms of regional class and race dialects. So, for example, it's very common to hear in the American South, in the Ozarks, in Appalachia, and among African American vernacular English speakers, the form I seen, right, where the past participle has taken over the past form, which is a process that has taken place in a lot of strong verbs, but was frozen in the 1700s. So it's I see, I saw, I see, I have seen, right? All right. I can go on about this for a while, but this is sort of a big overview of how verbs changed, didn't change, shifted around, changed back, and how we're still kind of confused about which verbs should be strong and which verbs should be weak. and it's entirely arbitrary which forms finally made it that way. One of the features of the Ozarks dialect, especially as spoken by older and more isolated people, is that there are a lot of Elizabethan forms. There's a lot of early modern forms that you might still find. You will hear, as of at least 75 to 50 years ago, you could hear old timers saying, "I clomb the tree" instead of "I climbed the tree," which is an early modern, strong past form of the verb climb. All right, let's talk about adjectives and adverbs. In the Middle English, in the early modern English period, adverbs do not consistently end with "ly." Comparatives and superlatives can be formed somewhat differently. We have more vowel changes. Like in modern English, we have, old, elder, eldest, right? But we also had long, lenger, lengest, strong, strenger, strangest. This was going away by around 1600, but we get more of them. We also have more variation in which words we can have an inflected comparison. That is not by adding more or most, but by adding or est to the end. So in Shakespeare's writing in early modern English, you'll get forms like honester and violentest. And also in early modern English, you get doubled forms, so that you get both the words, that the adverbs that go with it that make it comparative or superlative, and along with the ending. So you get forms like more larger, most boldest, or in Shakespeare, the most unkindest cut of all, or the worser welcome. Worser is funny because worse is already comparative, so he's adding a comparative form to a comparative. Now, you'll still observe these forms conspicuously in African American English, and there's and we'll talk in a later unit about the origins and development of African American vernacular English. But one of the big and this is evidence for one of the theories that a lot of African American vernacular English is closer in a lot of ways to spoken English of the 1600s and 1700s, that the people who were transported as enslaved people to North America at that time would have worked with Scots and Scots-Irish indentured servants, and would have been isolated and would have been restricted from having formal education. And so that they had these non-standard forms, which were in a way kind of removed, polished out of standard English language with other populations of English speakers, educated white people. And so you get forms like the Spike Lee movie, Mo Better Blues is more better blues, right? Another funny thing here, and maybe I'm triggering some people's pet peeves, is that than and then were used interchangeably as the comparative form. I am happier than he is, right? You could get than or then, and it hadn't been sort of shifted. Finally, let's talk about inflection loss. A lot of these things that we talked about, losing eth and est, and losing subjunctive forms of verbs in the early modern English period, which that actually had pretty much dropped out during the Middle English period. When we don't have words changing to indicate their role in a sentence, they can undergo much more easily the process of conversion, where a word can be changed from one part of speech to another without modification. This is called conversion as opposed to derivation. One of my pet peeves I used to have, which went away because you give up on these things, is the word gift as a verb. Like, I'm going to gift this to him. No, you give it to him. Gift is a noun, give is a verb. But gift has been converted from a noun into a verb in my lifetime. So with inflection loss, words can be changed from one part of speech to another without modification. This is called conversion, as opposed to derivation, where you change the form of a word to make it a different part of speech. So real is an adjective, but you can make it a verb by adding realize, right? So there's an example of conversion here in Shakespeare. Grace me no grace, nor uncle me, from Richard II again. Whom this beneath world doth embrace and hug, from Timon of Athens, is another example of conversion where beneath a preposition is being used as an adjective. He means the world below. I'm just reminded of this classic Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. I take nouns and adjectives and use them as verbs. Remember when axis was a thing? Now it's something you do. It got verbed. And Calvin decides that verbing weirds language, demonstrating the very process that he works about. But as you now have learned, this is something that has been going on for at least 500 years and is a consequence of inflection loss. All right. Thank you so much for learning more about early modern English morphology with me. Let me know if you have any questions. In our next video, I believe we will be talking about syntax, word order. Woo! Yeah. Bye.